So welcome to all those that have joined in the last 30 seconds. What we'll do, we'll take you through a number of areas. We'll start out just by setting the scene for why professional development, which I'm sure you all fully understand. I'll put in context a little bit about the research methodology and the process I took. We'll explore both the professional development planning process as well as the challenges that the participants faced when executing that process. I can share some insights into the approaches that other MATs are taking when considering these challenges and give you some points of reflection and takeaways as well. So if we start off with why professional development, Charlotte.
Yeah, so if we're going to look at the importance of effectively planning professional development, as we will later in this session, it's important to have an overview of why professional development is important in the first place. We are by now all familiar with the statistic that great quality teaching is the best way that schools can impact the achievement of children, that it's the single most important school-based factor impacting achievement, and consequently that huge aim of improving the life chances of children that we're all working towards in the education sector. So therefore, we should also pay a lot of attention to things that help teachers get better, and in particular, that means the role of professional development. So we also know that the best way to develop great quality teaching is through PD. So evidence has shown us that it's a better bet than grading lesson observations, assessing teachers against teachers' standards, or performance-related pay. There are statistics about professional development that are more familiar to us now than they may have been a few years ago, such as the one shown on this slide. So thanks to the DfE's recruitment and retention strategy, it's a really relevant time to be discussing the importance of professional development with the reforms to our ECT provision and the MPQs coming from the DfE, all with the purpose of keeping teachers in schools and raising standards. Another key piece of evidence tells us that leadership is second only to classroom teaching in its potential to generate school improvement. Leaders can impact on the quality of teaching through creating the conditions, so the school culture and professional environments where teachers keep getting better through high quality professional development, where behaviour is well managed and where there's a strong collaborative culture. This shows us what, when implemented properly across a school or trust, professional development does. So it empowers staff to work with their peers. It removes the onus from perhaps just one or two senior leaders in charge of coaching and developing all staff, and instead creates a culture of feeding back and striving for development. It makes that the norm. This has been quite visible to us, I'd say, over the last year, the increase in inquiries we've had from people just wanting to know how we can support them to implement a whole school coaching model and enable their staff to drive change from all levels. When planned and implemented across a whole school or trust, oh, sorry, Paul, can we flip back? Sorry. When planned and implemented across a whole school or trust, it can affect the whole culture of that organisation. And that shifting culture will help educators at all levels to develop faster and remain in their roles. And another great statistic is that we know developing teachers already in role is much more effective in improving schools than replacing staff. As well as the DfE's focus on reforming and developing professional development in schools, we can also see the onus being placed on effective professional development in the Confederation of Schools Trusts' new white paper, in which they set out 4 propositions that sort of neatly summarise the points I've covered so far today, which I'll just give you a second to look at now. However, they also acknowledge that in order for all of these 4 points to happen, and to happen sustainably, schools and trusts need to be undertaking what the Confederation of Schools Trusts call a forensic analysis of need, as well as monitoring the improvements in the effectiveness of provision.
So if that sort of outlines and confirms why professional development is important, when I joined Ambition and engaging with leaders within our organisation and just thinking about as well what is written in terms of literature on professional development, there's not as much written about the process itself. And I'd say as an organisation also, we know little about how trust leaders, directors of education approach planning and executing a professional development strategy. So it was an area that I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into to better understand. And in January, I wrote out, prepared a small pack on sort of what I aimed to achieve and what the research was about. I reached out to about 35, 40 directors of education and trust leaders to participate in the research, and fairly quickly I got 27 responses saying that they were interested in exploring this further. I think that alone provides at least some additional evidence that the topic itself, when we think about planning, is of interest and that there's value in exploring it a little bit deeper. So those interviews have been semi-structured in terms of the interviews themselves to explore the process and the problem. And I've followed those up with 9 workshops directly with those trust leaders and SLT to explore the challenges and think about implications and next steps. For all of those interviews and the workshops, they've been transcribed and they've been reviewed line by line following a sort of a grounded theory approach, and they've been coded accordingly, and those codes have been collated up to common themes and challenges and common processes. And that's what I will take you through, not all, but some of the main findings from the research. So when we talk about this process at the moment, and what I used as a point of reference as part of the discussion, were 3 distinct phases: how you diagnose and evaluate need, what programs you put on place to meet that need, and how you evaluate and monitor impact. What we'll look at specifically are the processes broadly that are followed. And then when we think about the execution of that process at the distinct phases, the 3 phases that I've outlined, what challenges they're facing executing the process. I think it's fair to say that you'd all agree that the main process for all PD planning, not as a process on its own, is sort of embedded within the self-evaluation and academy improvement plan. And that is a fairly robust process that is followed by all of the participants, and I'm sure you're doing the same. And then you have running in parallel with that, a performance management process, an annual appraisal, with some of the participants, not all, using the teacher standards as a point of reference for thinking about how they're evaluating teachers. These 2 processes per se are not always aligned, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. So I'd say for all of the participants, this challenge of bringing these 2 conversations together was outlined as both a challenge for all of them, that sort of separating professional development conversation from performance management was a key priority. If not all said that was something that they were either moving towards, and I'd say half of them had already adopted a process where they separated that performance management from professional development, where others said it was definitely a priority and something they wanted to consider. But the consistency of how these processes are operated, and we think about the flow of information, the governance structures that are in place, how need is evaluated, there is a lot of inconsistency across the board with all the people that I spoke to. And I think it would be fair to say, for bar 1 or 2 that would say more formal, I'd say the majority of those processes are quite informal and operational, to the degree I'd say quite reactive in how we think about diagnosing need, putting on programs, and then thinking about evaluating impact. There were 1 or 2 that did have quite a more formal process, but again, I'd say the consistency of how that was actually deployed within academies was quite varied. And the MATs that I spoke to were varying inside. One had up to 18 academies, one had 2, one was a teaching school hub. So there was a real mix in terms of both size, complexity, and scale from the people I spoke to. So I think it's fair to say that broadly, when we think about the formality of the process, that yes, it happens. It may not happen as consistently and as formally as we would like. And it's definitely not at this stage as strategic as we would like it to be. but I think there is evidence to say that they are looking at, and they would all say that they are on a journey. A common analogy that was used, that we're kind of flying the plane, building the plane and flying it at the same time. So this is part of a journey, and I think part of the reasons why they were interested in exploring this process. At this stage, I'm going to go in reverse order, because most of the challenges and issues I found were at the diagnose and evaluate phase of the process. So I'm just going to touch on lightly the other two, so that when we think about monitoring and evaluating impact, I think it'd be fair to say for all of the participants, if you were to ask how are you actually measuring the impact of the professional development that you put on to support your teachers, outside of maybe surveys asking the participants how they found the program, were they satisfied, do they believe it delivered impact, that none of them were looking directly at trying to draw a correlation between the program itself and the direct impact it has on pupil outcomes or pupil attainment. So, and that was definitely a challenge, and something that they were interested in exploring further. And I know, at least from an organizational perspective at Ambition Institute, this is obviously something that we are really interested in exploring further as well. I think at the programs phase, it would be fairly easy for me to say we're not spoilt for lack of choice. There is a lot out there. Now, with the Early Career Framework and the new MPQs all being fully funded, there is a lot of choice. And all of the MATs had varying degrees of programs that they were offering, from embedded instructional coaching to bespoke leadership programs, some on ethical, some on specific but bespoke programs that were really tailored to them. But there's not a shortage of choice when it comes to PD programs. And you're not far away from a new idea, a new concept, a new way of working, a new hot potato that's potentially launched on Twitter every other week as a new initiative or an impact or a program that delivers impact. There's not a shortage of choice. The challenge, I think, more deeply lies at how we diagnose and evaluate need. And specifically at a teacher level and at a leader level, the diagnosis, the evaluation, the assessment of individual teachers and leaders' professional development needs was a challenge for the majority of the participants, 93%. With that, the granularity of the data and insight used to make informed decisions on PD choice was also a challenge. The data available to do talent mapping and succession planning was a challenge for 40%. And broadly, there was feedback that there was a lack of a common language for great teaching and learning within the academy and across the trust. And I'll come on to that point later. But if we look at the other two, the reason why they may be lower is I've been strict to the fidelity of the research in only capturing what was explicitly said in those interviews. And as I've said, they were semi-structured. So whilst they may not have said directly that the granularity of data and insight used to inform decisions was a challenge, we know that if diagnosing and evaluating need is at 93%, then you don't necessarily have the data and you're not able to make informed decisions because you don't have that data to you to make those decisions. So I think there's further information that I know through the follow-up, the workshops that were carried out, that point towards the granularity of data and insight as well wasn't necessarily where they would like it to be. So it was broadly, I think when we think about understanding teacher need, how do I best do it? What process do I follow? How do I best capture it? What frameworks do I use to explore those areas? And how am I using that data to make better informed decisions? And even where it is being done, how do I make sure that that's consistent? And how do I ensure that I am best evaluating and empowering the individual to talk openly and confidently about their challenges, their areas of development, which comes a little bit into that push-pull between performance management and professional development. But how do I best do that? I think if I take a step back from that and just lean a little bit on existing literature, we're not far away from evidence that says this stage is really important, and done well can really inform better professional development choice. I'd go as far to say, even hot off the press with the EF's publication only last week on effective professional development from Sam Sims and Harry Fletcher Wood, that even this talks about, no matter how well designed the program itself, the context of which it's set up, the contents that's used, even the number of mechanisms of the 14 that were identified in this that were deemed appropriate and that would drive good professional development and effective professional development. It's about putting that in the context. For it to be successful, it needs to be tied to the context of the school. And I would argue and take that a stage further and pull in some of the previous evidence to say that school context needs to be drilled down at an individual level so that better understanding then is made of need and requirement. So it starts to raise some questions around, how do I ensure I have the right data to make informed decisions? How do I start to build that learning culture? And I think you can't build that learning culture if you're not engaging and putting on programs that are supporting teachers in their professional development, and you're really engaging them and understanding learning and development need. And how do I start to think more strategically about professional development and start to transition away from maybe a more informal and operational process to something that is more strategic? I think part of our challenge is back to the question that was raised around, we have a lack of a common language. So where is my reference point? And where is my North Star within my academy and across my trust? If I turn to the teacher standards, they're very good at setting out for me what is expected if I'm a teacher. What they don't necessarily do is provide guidance on the more complex elements and the craft of teaching. So there is a challenge, I think, to move beyond what is expected of me in terms of what's defined within the teacher standards and the association of those standards to the harder metrics of performance management, and start to think about, okay, well, what for us as an academy and as a trust, what does great teaching and learning look like? And how could I start to use that to better understand individual learning and development needs? It was definitely something that when we discussed and explored, okay, so how do I do that? How do I really drill down and understand individual need? How do I best capture it? What do I use? What framework do I use? And, at the moment, again, I would say about 93% of the participants didn't have that common language for engagement and talking about great teaching and learning. So again, a couple of the mats are taking specific approaches to tackle these challenges. One of them is the Charlotte Danielson framework, and this is a mat that has taken this framework. There are 4 domains within the framework: preparing, planning and preparation, the classroom environment, instruction, professional responsibilities. And there are a raft of domains, subdomains under each of those, 22. And against each of those subdomains, there is a level of proficiency. So this is what I would deem as under satisfactory. This is what basic behavior and attributes would look like, versus this is exemplification in a certain area. So when I think about the classroom environment, this is what I would expect as distinguished activity or behavior or things that you would expect the teacher to be doing. Another mat, I suppose important just to say on this, what this mat has done is driving all, both inset days or twilight sessions are all done then off the back of this. So teachers are using this to think about where I have strength, where I have capability. where I may be against these levels of proficiency, and identifying then elements of need and requirement at an individual level. He's embedded within that Rose and Shine principles, and that is their starting point for thinking about individual staff professional development and learning requirements. Another Matt has started to look at the Great Teacher Toolkit, a very good piece of evidence review on a broad range of classifications and evidence on what great teaching and learning is. 4 domains. What this doesn't necessarily have is the levels of proficiency that sit underneath it, but they're starting to explore what that might be for them. And finally, one other Matt who has taken an element of all 3 and decided to take a more personal approach, and they've defined their own, something that's relevant to them, personal to them, and they're defining, they've got 4, maybe 6 domains that they've identified as great teaching and learning, and they're using that to engage their teachers. So if I just take a step back and offer some points of reflection and some key takeaways. As an organisation, Ambition Institute, I would say when we think about great teaching and learning, for all the work that has gone into the early career framework over the last 2 years, I'd say that when we think about the main domains that sit with it on the outside of this graph, they are the building blocks and pillars for great teaching and learning. Whilst it may be positioned as a programme for early career teachers, the evidence, the insight, the practical application, and the further reading that sits under each of these domains provides an awful lot of evidence and support, not just for individual teachers, but for more experienced teachers as well. So as one way of thinking about that common language, the early career framework gives a way of enabling me as a teacher to reflect on my own teaching, to think about maybe through a heat map where I believe I've got strength and capability and where I've got areas of personal development, and how that information is then used and where it's passed up in terms of governance structures to make those informed decisions about PD. And that's exactly what one Matt that I've worked with head teachers and SLT are starting to do. They're looking at levels of proficiency against the early career framework, and they're starting to position that with staff as a way of reflection to think about need and requirement and building up those heat maps on need. And I think if that is collated and amalgamated up at a trust level, it gives you one additional source, not the only source, but an additional source of information when thinking about then individual need and requirement. And I suppose when we go back to the question around sort of embedding professional development, embedding a culture of learning and development, and having the approach that we all leaders are leading by example and constantly learning, I think it is important to be putting teachers at the center of what we're doing. And this point of self-reflection for them gives them a sense that we are starting to think about their needs and requirements and best capture what they are, and then understand how best we can support them. But it's not just about staff development. You know, a good professional development strategy looks at developing capabilities. It also is there to support, attract and retain talent. It's there to motivate and engage staff. It's about supporting and building a culture. And it's about building the brand of the trust and schools externally in terms of external engagement as well. So one of the things that I'm developing at the moment are the idea of a set of domains of professional development strategy. And I leave these questions here just really as takeaways, as point of reflection for you to think about at a strategic level. Do you have a clear purpose as to why professional development and learning? And is that embedded within the heart of your school improvement strategy? And where do you think you operate on that informal operational versus strategic and more formal development process? How you're embedding that learning culture with senior leaders that sort of fosters that mindset, that growth mindset in all staff, and that what are those governance structures and the flow of information when you do have some of these insights at an individual level? Where is that data going? What operational models you have? What working groups are in place? What governance structures gathers that data to co-evaluate it and to think about then collectively as a group of heads how we move that forward? One of the areas that I've not mentioned here, again, which was about, I'd say about 75–80% of the participants raised as a challenge, and this was more with the CEOs, was the changing of mindsets and approaches, and this battle between autonomy, headship autonomy, and the role then of the trust and how they best support and come together. And I think, you know, positioning this ability to get heads in a working group to then co-evaluate, co-understand, and then co-design the type of professional development that is put on to support teachers could be one way to alleviate some of that challenge. I'm pulling out specifically professional development and learning needs because I think, again, in a lot of literature, it's there, but it's more as an afterthought. A lot of what is written about effective PD relies more and focuses more on the content, the form it takes, and as we've seen with the new EEF literature, the mechanisms that are put in place to make it successful. The type of offering you're putting in place and how you are supporting individual career pathways and individual learning journeys. I think the mechanisms that you're putting in place to evaluate, specifically the choices that are made for professional development learning and what you're actually running in terms of the programs. And a little bit wider, when we think about the ecosystem of professional development and learning, that landscape across the academy, across the school and the trust, you know, how are you putting individuals at the heart of that? How are you establishing both internal and potentially external learning communities, and how you're fostering that culture of evaluation and understanding of more data, so that with that data and insight that you can make more informed decisions around individual learning journeys and the type of professional development to be putting on that will inform then things like talent mapping and succession planning as well. These are just some of the quotes that I've had back from the people that I've worked with, and I think the takeaway for a lot of this is that you're all really busy. And one of the real values I think a lot of the participants have had in this process is just that ability to take back and take stock every now and then, and just to think about with a blank sheet of paper, where are we? Where are some of our challenges, and what do we really want to be focusing on? Of all the things that we could do in the next term, half term, what one or two things do we really think are important, and how do we move them forward? So that's me. Thank you. I'll stop there and open to any questions. No questions is a good thing.
I had a question, Paul, if that's okay.
Yep, all right.
Just when you put the initial slide up about diagnosis or kind of executing professional development and then evaluation, and then
Yep.
later on we've talked about evaluation, but we've gone to self-evaluation of staff. Sometimes they can be blinded by their own bias, can't they? Whether that be within a school or personally themselves when they're reflecting on the quality of teaching. So when we do look at evaluation, if 93% of leaders are saying that diagnosis is the most difficult thing,
yeah,
what else did you ask about other than self-reflection? Because I agree it's challenging, but there's many components in which we can evaluate staff performance to try and diagnose where we try to introduce professional development to make them get better.
So yeah, I suppose we didn't look at broader aspects of the type of things that could be put in place to support what that may look like.
Right.
It was more about, I think the challenge when you think about, yes, there's self-reflection, but I think even without that, it's where do I start? And I think if broadly, whether that be self-reflection or not, alternative methods, it's what else could I use to think about understanding professional learning and development need. And I think the self-reflection is one point. Obviously, there'll be a lot of insights and data that you have through the self-evaluation and the academy improvement plans that will inform some of that decision. So that's why I say it's one source of data.
Yeah.
But I think it is, you're right. I think at an individual level, it could be quite biased. So this, for me, does highlight, I think, the real importance of a good instructional coach and teacher educator, so that I can be having that open dialogue. And I think even as a first stepping stone, so we acknowledge this is a challenge, is this at least the first stepping stone that enables us to think about putting staff at the heart of what we do. And if I can start to engage and understand and give you, if we've got that common language, if I've got something that says this is what we believe are the pillars of great teaching and learning within our academy and across our trust, we're starting to talk about similar things at SLT as we engage with the teachers. And it gives then both the head teacher, the manager, the line manager, or the coach that point of discussion then between what the individual thinks and then what they may think when you think if they are doing. And we tend to rely less on observation, but still, if done well through things like deliberate practice, it's a starting point for me. It's not the only answer. It's about the first step on the ladder in moving this forward.
Thank you.
Paul, I just wondered if your sort of final few slides with all those questions given around some sort of tool for MAT leadership to ask themselves those questions in their planning sessions, so that they get themselves going on that culture, obviously those good decisions around PD. And I think some of those questions are really useful and really reflective. As a leadership team, it would be really interesting to sort of kind of unpick some of those. And bring it back to some of the, linking back to the EF implementation. We do tend to rush into the doing. I think we can spend a lot of time. The danger is we spend too much time talking shop and not enough action stations as well. So you've got to get the back that could be structured to give something for trust leaders to kind of to work through, if you like.
I think
I didn't know if that was something you were.
You're breaking up a little bit, Samantha, but I think I think you're right. I think those questions do give a starting point for leaders to think about some of those points, but I would also encourage that it's not just maybe even a subjective view of leadership that answers those questions. And I wonder what questions and what feedback, what responses you might get if those questions were asked.
Yeah, good point.
Right the way through, and whether there would be consistency in that.
No, that's a really good point, and bring it back to the wider sort of how they contribute to that planning and how that supports them to be better teachers is really, it's
yeah. I think the main takeaway for me with a lot of the engagement has always been, where is that point of reference? Where do I turn? What do we refer to? So if we're thinking beyond, if the teacher standards give me a good set, an outline of what is expected of me as a teacher, I think, how do I think beyond that? And what is my point of reference? How and where do I turn to think about my own personal development and learning needs? And how have a better conversation with my coach, with my mentor and my line manager to try and tie, because as Nathan said, I think I may perceive I've got strengths and capability in certain areas, but actually feedback from peers, from the line manager. And I think it's, again, we're trying to encourage the empowerment of individuals to think about their own professional development needs. It's so kind of, you come away from ITT and you're always told that reflection is really important, but it kind of gets lost in the ether as you start doing your day job. And I think that reflection, not only for you, but also engagement with peers and colleagues, is an important component then of just trying to round away some of that subjectivity and personal opinion that may come out of such a level of diagnosis. Ben has asked whether the slides will be shared. Yes, happy to share the slides, and by all means, if you do have any further questions, by all means reach out to myself. Happy to support where we can. Any other questions? So maybe I can ask a question in light of what I've said. Does that resonate at all with you, with people in the audience?
I'd say, Paul, yes, it definitely resonates. And I think I find a challenge of, I acknowledge the power of impact, of evaluation to look at impact, but then trying to balance that with creating an environment that's kind of organic enough to enable innovation and have a little bit of freedom. Do you know what I mean? So it's not overly clinical. And I don't know if I'm describing that very well, but trying to have something where people are prepared to explore something without it being a set, right, you're going to do this because that's a desired outcome, very robotic almost. Yeah,
I think one of the things, I think this is about getting everybody to a certain level. And then from that level of innovation and creativity, you've got the freedom to do, because you're all operating at the same level. I think one of the CEOs said, look, if I tried to deploy something like this in its full glory just now, and really be getting our teachers to be innovative and think about what they could do differently, I said they just won't be ready. It's just too early. I need to get them to a point where they're all at the same level to a degree, and then we work from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the framework is there anyway, isn't it? Regardless, you have that as a to be able to articulate the approach. That's the key, I think, for me, that I took from it.
Yeah, it's, if it's not that, then it's what else could we use? And I think it's there, and it's not just that it's the early career framework. There is a lot of really good insight, evidence, application, and further reading for those that really do want to challenge. So not all of it's relevant, but in principle, it's the content that sits in it is of value. We do kind of implicitly make reference to the point that it's not just for early career teachers. There's some really good content there for all teachers. Yeah. Anybody else, finally, before we close down? Thank you, everybody. Great. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Paul and Charlotte.
Thank you.